So I'm very happy to be here to talk to you about arguably what's the most complicated, emotionally charged and difficult topic in international relations today, and that's the ISIS crisis. As someone who spent my adult life teaching the politics of the Middle East, traveling to the region, thinking about the politics of the region and its connection to the rest of the world, I haven't been this disillusioned, concerned, and worried about the future of the Middle East as I am today. And my own fundamental interpretation of the politics of the region is that ISIS, in many ways, is a reflection of the deep crisis that the region has been facing for many decades. And unfortunately, the prognosis, from my perspective, does not look good. But I'm reminded of that famous saying by James Peck at the beginning of the Chomsky Reader, where he says that however troubling reality may be, human dignity cannot be affirmed in fleeing it. Rather, dignity lies in seeing reality for what it is and acting responsibly in the face of it. So with that introduction, the obvious question that pertains to this topic of ISIS is, what's the best analytical framework? What's the best framework of analysis? What's the best point of departure to understand this particular topic? Is the ISIS crisis fundamentally a byproduct of something that is inherent within the religion of Islam or Arab culture, as some people have argued? Richard Haass, the president of the Council on Foreign Relations, has claimed that the problem with the Middle East is that it is a region that has not come to terms with modernity. And this is why we are facing these crises. Similarly, President Obama has made the argument on several occasions that what we are seeing in the Middle East is the playing out of, quote, ancient sectarian differences. Recently, at his State of the Union address, he spoke about conflict that date back a millennia, suggesting that perhaps we're seeing a Muslim version of the Christian wars of religion that go back to the 16th and 17th century, and the implication being there's not much the world, especially the United States, can do about it. We simply have to wait until these conflicts burn themselves out. Or is the problem with ISIS fundamentally a byproduct of something more recent? The 2003 American Anglo invasion and occupation of Iraq and the legacy of that disastrous foreign policy decision. I think in all of those three scenarios that I've laid out, there are elements of truth. But from my own perspective, fundamentally, I situate the ISIS crisis in what I hinted at a moment ago, the broken politics of the Middle East. The politics in the Middle East are broken. They don't function in normal ways. And this is not a function of culture or civilizations. It's a function of bad governance and very predictable consequences that all of us can wrap our minds around. And so in my own understanding, as someone who has been studying this region for most of my adult life, I situate the ISIS crisis as a function of two sets of political developments that have been brewing in the region for several decades and have now converged at this point in time to create a vacuum that has produced the ISIS crisis. The first development that has been underway in the Middle East and that has been corroding the politics and societies of the Middle East is the legacy of political authoritarianism. The political landscape in this region for much of its modern history has been characterized by different forms of authoritarian political regimes. Some, but not all, supported by the West. But these authoritarian regimes, of which they vary, have corroded and corrupted their own societies. And we're seeing the results of this decade upon decade of political authoritarianism emerging now. And it's converged with the other key development that has been destroying and destabilizing the Middle East, and that is the predictable consequences that flow from state breakdown and state collapse. And it's precisely in this framework of the legacy of political authoritarianism and the predictable consequences that flow from state breakdown and state collapse that I think we can and should situate the ISIS crisis. Now, authoritarian regimes in the Middle East are not all the same. There are some regimes that if you were to sort of compare them, for example, if you were to rank all of the 22 member countries or states in the Arab League, and if you were to rank them on a spectrum of repression, the two countries that I think deserve to be ranked at the end of a spectrum of repression in terms of the brutal nature of the regimes and the very corrosive and toxic effects that those particular regimes at the end of this spectrum of repression, this end being the most repressive, you would have to situate the post-colonial regimes in Iraq and Syria as being qualitatively distinct in terms of the nature of the authoritarian, hard authoritarian, if not totalitarian regimes that were in power under the Ba'ath parties of Iraq and Syria, how they tried to control, manipulate, destroy their own societies, creating generation after generation of people who have known nothing but totalitarianism, fear, anxiety. That has produced consequences. That has destroyed, in many ways, created a situation where these societies from within families, within communities, their conception of government, their view of the world, has been very deeply corroded. And that is central, I think, to understanding the roots of the ISIS crisis. The concept of social cohesion here is relevant. Social scientists have long recognized that stable polities are rooted in a dense network of voluntary associations that help to sustain civil society and community relations. This generates social capital, social trust, produces cooperation among citizens of diverse backgrounds, thus creating conditions that enhance social integration by cultivating ties that bind society together, promoting peace and stability over the long term. Now, this internal legacy of authoritarianism in the Arab world has produced the exact opposite of what I just described. Instead of social cohesion, there has been social disintegration. Instead of social trust, there has been widespread fear and distrust of strangers, of other citizens, who may be paid informants of the various state intelligence services that have dominated society and whose job millions of people are employed in these intelligence services run by the Ministry of Interior or Ministry of Intelligence to spy on their fellow citizens for the ruling regime. The net result of this form of political life, after decade upon decade, produces a culture of fear, paranoia, anxiety, conspiracy theories, thus opening the door to social disintegration when the radical shock hits society in the form of a war, state collapse, uprising, or revolution. Everything is then up for grabs, and the door to radicalization is thus opened. That's broadly the legacy of political authoritarianism and the consequences that it has had on the Middle East. The second development, the predictable consequences that flow from war and state collapse, are not difficult to understand. Take the case of Iraq, for example. For the last 36 years approximately, Iraq has known some form of war, either directly or indirectly, that has deeply destroyed Iraqi society. From 1980 to 1988, there was an event that you might remember called the Iran-Iraq War. It killed about 250,000 Iraqis, destroyed its economy, created a massive debt. There was a brief interim period until the Iraqi invasion and occupation of Iraq, Gulf War I, international coalition, Iraq was attacked, its economic infrastructure further destroyed, thousands of soldiers killed, including some civilians, but the devastation that really affected Iraqi society was what happened afterwards. The so-called oil for food program, the very comprehensive and intrusive and oppressive UN economic sanctions that were placed on Iraq that destroyed Iraq in terms of its basic human development indicators, massive increase in infant immortality, a massive increase in sort of malnourishment, civil society destroyed, and that brings us up to 2003 and the American invasion of Iraq, and you all know the rest of the story. Chaos, mayhem, the fracturing of the country, a sectarian war, the emergence of al-Qaeda. That's basically been Iraq's history. That legacy of war and state collapse, where the central government in Baghdad no longer has authority to lay claim over its territory, is a big part of the background to the rise of ISIS. Of course, ISIS as an organization emerges in Iraq after the American invasion in 2003. Syria, you have a similar situation. The only difference is basically two issues. One, thank you. One, the war in Syria is not as long. It goes back about 5 years to 2011. But the social effects and the consequences of the war in Syria now have been much greater on Syrian society than they have been on Iraq. Half of Syria's population now are either internally displaced or they've been turned into refugees. But 250,000 people have been killed. Life expectancy has dropped 27 years in the last 5 years since the war started. The entire country has been devastated. And there's no hope that that's going to change anytime soon. So when you put these two things together, you have a situation that's ripe for the insertion of radicalism in this vacuum that has been created. Just to drive home the point with respect to Syria, that after the end of the first year of the Syrian uprising, to give you a sense of just how bad Syria has become, all of the leading human rights organizations, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and the UN Special Commission of Inquiry, describe what was happening in Syria as a case of state-sanctioned war crimes and crimes against humanity. The UN Secretary General has repeatedly called on the world to address the suffering in Syria using the term, quote, and this was a term that was 3 years old now. Syria is now the biggest humanitarian and peace and security crisis facing the world, and the situation has got only worse since then. And as I said before, Syria has not only produced a massive refugee crisis, the worst refugee crisis since World War II. About 500,000 Syrians have fled their country, trying to get into Europe. About 4 million Syrian refugees officially registered now as UN refugee, they have UN refugee status. About 500,000 of them have fled into Europe, many of them actually just walking from Turkey into Syria. The conflict has produced a chemical weapons crisis, an unreported but devastating rape crisis, a polio crisis, a hunger crisis, a torture crisis, and as a result of all of this, an ISIS crisis. So that, I think, fundamentally is the framework in which we need to understand the rise of ISIS. Legacy of authoritarianism, political tyranny, repression, destroying communities, families, individuals, in terms of how they view each other, and then you have the devastation of war in Iraq and in Syria. A vacuum is created, Islamic militancy emerges as a result, but there's much more to the story than simply that. You also have the problem of what I have here as listed, the political legitimacy of the state in both Iraq and Syria. The central governments suffer from a crisis of legitimacy. In the post-2003 American order that was established in Iraq, you basically had a situation where Shia political parties came to power for one simple reason. They had the demographic numbers. 60% of Iraq are Shia. Under Saddam Hussein, they were deeply repressed. They come to power, and unfortunately, the Shia political parties and the prime minister that was in charge of Iraq from 2006 to 2014, Nouri al-Maliki, supported by the international community, ruled Iraq in a way that privileged the Shia Iraqi citizens and ignored, repressed, alienated the 20% of Iraqis who were Sunni. When they protested, when they complained, when they demanded representation and accountability, they were repressed. And there was one case where there was a massacre, about 50 Iraqi Sunnis were massacred in 2013, and that was the turning point. And then some Iraqi Sunnis gave up on the Iraqi state. They felt that it was no longer able to provide any sense of justice or representation for Iraqi Sunnis, and they started to look elsewhere. And that elsewhere is in the direction of ISIS. Similar situation in Syria. You have a minority regime in Syria from a small Alawite minority run by the Assad family, been in power for 45 years. All of the key positions are staffed by Assad loyalists. 70% of Syria are Sunni. That was in many ways what the uprising 5 years ago was all about. The situation has got much worse. And so you have a fundamental crisis of the legitimacy of the states in these two countries that are in question. Moving quickly ahead, all roads lead to Damascus. There is no fundamental way of understanding, I think, the ISIS crisis in all of its complexity unless we understand the centrality, specifically of the war in Syria and how that has contributed to the rise and expansion of ISIS. Syria is like a geopolitical Chernobyl, to quote one high-ranking American general. It's going to continue to spew radioactivity and instability and extremist ideology over the entire region. Until this conflict is brought to an end, there can be no resolution of the ISIS crisis unless there is a resolution of the internal conflict within Syria that revolves around the house of Assad and his rule over the country and the demands for political change and for some form of alternative government. People don't remember the history, but if you know the history, in 2011 approximately, 2010, 2011, the Al-Qaeda franchise that emerged in Iraq after the American occupation, by the year 2010, 2011, was a broken organization. It was defeated. Its senior leaders were either killed or captured. It no longer had popular support, largely because of the brutality. It was on its last legs. But then 2011 coincided with another major event and development in the politics of the Arab world, known as the Arab Spring. These revolutions that erupted starting in Tunisia, demanding hope, accountability, political change, comes to Syria in March of 2011. And so-called president of Syria, Bashar al-Assad, backed by Iran and Russia, respond to peaceful protests. Protests in Syria for most of 2011 were overwhelmingly peaceful, overwhelmingly nonviolent, overwhelmingly non-sectarian, demanding the same thing that other Arabs and other countries were demanding for: democracy, dignity, social justice. Assad responds to those peaceful protests with merciless brutality that by the first year is characterized as a situation of, as I mentioned earlier, state-sanctioned war crimes and crimes against humanity. The international community does nothing to get involved, and a political vacuum starts to emerge. That peaceful revolution, as a result of the brutality of the Assad regime, slowly becomes militarized, as a Free Syrian Army is emerging to simply defend people from being shot by the Syrian army. Then that revolt, after becoming militarized, becomes radicalized. As radical militants start to increase, that is typical in the case of a situation that is borderline genocidal. People that emerge from that type of conflict are not Swedish liberal Democrats, but people who are angry, who are upset, and who want revenge. That's perfectly normal and understandable. And so a big part of the crisis with ISIS is because of what has been happening in Syria. When the uprising in Syria began in 2011, there was no ISIS. There was no Al-Qaeda. But that starts to change as we get to 2012 and as we get to 2013 in the context of the chaos and the horrors of the Syrian civil war. As the Middle East journalist Robin Wright has correctly noted, Syria is the strategic center of the region. What happens there will affect everybody. And so there are broader lessons here, I think, that are worth drawing your attention to. Conflicts that are so catastrophic from a human rights perspective that they rise to the level of either genocide or borderline genocidal activity. Massive war crimes, crimes against humanity, those conflicts rarely stay within their borders. They spill across their borders and they contaminate the region, and in the age of globalization, they affect the entire world. That's exactly what has happened in Syria. The calculation among many of the foreign policy analysts in this country, when Syria started to erupt in 2011, 2012, was that, look, foreign policy, international relations is best informed by a realist perspective. Yes, there might be human rights violations. Yes, there might be genocide. But the question for the United States is, does what's happening in Syria affect our core national interests? President Obama and his advisors calculated that no, it does not. And so the calculation in 2012 was that what was happening in Syria could be contained within Syria. Perhaps Assad would win. He's getting support from Russia and Iran and Hezbollah, and maybe they'll just end that conflict. That was the calculation back then. But that was, I think, a calculation that we can now see was the greatest miscalculation of President Obama's foreign policy. I predict it will haunt him in the same way that Rwanda and Bosnia haunted President Clinton. And what happened in Syria didn't stay in Syria. It produced the worst refugee crisis of the 21st century. It produced a chemical weapons crisis. It produced all of those crises that I mentioned before. And it's going to continue to produce crises. We haven't seen the worst yet. That's the tragedy of Syria, and there's lessons here. I'm reminded of exactly what happened in this world about 20 years ago when you had a similar situation in Bosnia. And President Clinton then made a very similar calculation. Bosnia does not affect our core national interests. But the conflict continued. It turned into genocide. Then you had Srebrenica. The entire southeastern Europe started to be destabilized, and then there was a shift in policy when President Obama decided to act. Of course, he acted 3 years too late. Most of the killing had been done, but the conflict was brought to an end as a result of the Dayton Course. So that is, I think, a lesson here for all of us to think about. Moving quickly ahead, there is a deep connection between the rise of ISIS, its expansion, its ability to attract these foreign fighters, and the ending or the crushing of the Arab Spring revolts, which began about 5 years ago this month. When democratic openings are closed or crushed, and when moderate forms of religious expression are denied a voice in the public sphere, what you get as a result and as a consequence is that radical expressions of religion, in this case radical expressions of political Islam, benefit and rise to the top. There's a very good study that was published a couple of years ago that looked at the jihadi discourse in the Arab world during the Arab Spring. And it basically concluded that Al-Qaeda had a message in 2011 and 2012 that was incoherent, that was unattractive, that could not gain a critical mass of followers, because you had political change coming about seemingly through nonviolent protests. And that undermined one of the central claims of Al-Qaeda, that the only way to bring about political change in the Arab Islamic world was through violent revolution. They lost followers. They had an incoherent message. They were quickly becoming irrelevant. Bin Laden was assassinated. The hope was that perhaps the Arab world was moving in a new direction. But then, as we got to 2012, 2013 for sure, the old deep state, the old ruling elites started to fight back, started to reassert themselves, started to regain control. And I think the key event here was the military coup that took place in Egypt in the summer of 2013. When the democratic process, as chaotic and as difficult as it was in Egypt, was brought to an end, when the military reasserted itself, massacred, at least on one day, there were several massacres, but the biggest one was in August 14th, 2013, where about 1,000 people in downtown Cairo were killed by the Egyptian military in what Human Rights Watch called likely the biggest killing of civilians in human history. Supported by, indirectly, at least by military that's financed by the United States of America. We give about $1.2 billion of aid to Egypt. And as a result of what happened, as a result of the closing of that democratic process in Egypt, you've had an expansion of radicalism, of violence. In the 22 months before the coup d'etat, there was about 70 acts of violence. In the 22 months after the coup d'etat, 700. And one of the consequences of this is that radical opinion, Al-Qaeda and ISIS in particular, are starting to gain a new currency. And we know this because people have come out of the Egyptian prison system. And they're telling us what the internal debates are among prisoners. There's about 42,000 political prisoners in Egypt today, most of them Muslim Brotherhood, some secularists and liberals and others. And these people are cellmates, and they have debates. And one of the stories that has come out that's related to this theme that I'm talking about is that the ISIS narrative, the ISIS worldview, is the most popular one among Egyptian prisoners. And the story goes as follows. And this is from the stories that we're getting from prisoners who've been in the middle of these debates. The ISIS supporters in Egyptian prisons walk around very arrogant, very confident, mocking and pointing to Muslim Brotherhood prisoners and saying, "You stupid idiots. We told you so. We told you that elections are not going to bring about political change. We told you that the world doesn't care about democracy or human rights. Look where you are right now. Look at the tortured victims around you. The only way to bring about political change is what we said from the beginning, through revolution, through armed struggle, through a radical rewriting of the rules of the Middle East." And the political prisoners in Egypt who are listening to this debate, according to testimonies that we have, are all silent. There's no response to the ISIS critique. And they gain sympathy, and they're winning supporters, because that's exactly the political reality in Egypt today. You have two options if you're a young Egyptian person interested in political change. Either you shut up and you accept General el-Sisi's neo-fascist political order, or if you're interested in political change, you look for some project, for some group, for some cause. And the one that's getting a lot of publicity these days is the ISIS narrative. And so this all goes to, I think, prove a truism about politics everywhere, not just in the Middle East, best articulated by John F. Kennedy in 1962 when he famously said that when peaceful revolution becomes impossible, violent revolution becomes inevitable. And let me just quickly now turn to sort of one of the last themes here, because I want to leave time for questions and answers. And that's the question of the ideas. Where do the ideas of ISIS come from? The anger, the theological interpretation of ISIS is deeply connected to the mainstreaming and the development of a particular Sunni form of Islam that is deeply sectarian, intolerant, misogynistic, anti-women, anti-minority. And this is a development of a theological interpretation that, historically speaking, is relatively recent. And it is deeply connected to what one scholar has called the rise of the culture of ugliness in modern Islam. This culture of ugliness continues to be the single most important obstacle to articulating reasonable narratives of the possibility of Islam's contribution to human goodness. And the dissemination of this particular interpretation of Islam is connected to the policies of one country in particular in the Middle East, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. Now, Saudi Arabia has been promoting this particular interpretation of Islam. Just to give you a sense of how bad things are, in the summer of 2014, when ISIS emerges on the world stage, they engaged in, you might recall, a series of public executions of hostages in the summer of 2014, in August, early September, distributed on social media. At the exact same time, Saudi Arabia was also beheading people. In the same time period, about 21 people were executed in Saudi Arabia, most of them by beheadings, and not one Western government protested. If you look at the crime and punishment provisions in Saudi Arabia, they are very similar to the laws that are being implemented in ISIS-controlled areas. if you look at, you can't see that, but if you email me, if you look at the crime and punishment provisions for treason, murder, slander, adultery, stealing, that the ISIS forces implement and the punishments that they prescribe, most of them death or cutting off hands. In Saudi Arabia, you have the exact same set of crime and punishment provisions. And this cartoon captures, I think, the distinction. One is viewed as a barbaric death cult. The other is a friend and ally. Now, there are differences in terms of the Wahhabi interpretation that comes out of Saudi Arabia that the Saudis have been promoting and disseminating, and the one that we see in ISIS-controlled areas. Both of them have the same underlying theological roots that go back to the teachings of this 18th century individual by the name of Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab, who sort of developed this particular narrative. But they have different political agendas. The one in Saudi Arabia, the Wahhabi school of thought in Saudi Arabia, basically preaches deference to the monarch. You can have these types of attitudes toward women and toward men and toward people of other religions, but when it comes to political power, you respect the ruling political regime that's in power. ISIS has a different view of politics. They believe in a caliphate. They don't believe in monarchies. They believe that all the existing regimes in the Middle East need to be torn down and the borders need to be redrawn. So the underlying theology is the same. The political interpretation of that theology is quite different. And of course, this has become a problem, the question of Saudi Wahhabism, over the course of the 20th century, when Saudi Arabia becomes a major oil producer. And it starts to spread. It uses its oil wealth and starts to spread this particular interpretation of Islam around the world in Muslim communities. And through scholarships, through the spreading of literature, through a building of mosques and appointing imams, this increasingly becomes a problem. A colleague of mine conducted a study in one particular Muslim community in Birmingham, England, and he looked at the literature that was used in one community in that part of Europe. 80% of the literature, the books, the literature that were used in the local bookstore and in the mosque came from a Saudi Salafi theological interpretation. Many of the acts of violence that have shocked us here in the West have had direct Saudi links. Take the Boston bombers. The Boston bombers came from Chechnya, former Soviet Union, Dagestan, Chechnya, in the Caucasus. After the demise of the Soviet Union, religion is released from the control of the state. The Saudis step in, spend a lot of money, build mosques, spreading this particular theological interpretation of Islam, to which these young Tsarnaev brothers were exposed to, displacing and deflecting a more traditional, tolerant interpretation of Islam that existed in that part of the Muslim world that had Sufi underpinnings. And this particular interpretation of Islam fits in with the radicalization process, or enhances the radicalization process of these two young men, their anger, their displacement. And it provides a certain framework that allowed them to do what they did in Boston in April of 2013. The question of the Paris bombings and what happened in Belgium also has Saudi roots. If someone asks me about that, I will be happy to go into detail. So Saudi Arabia is a big problem here. Saudi Arabia has been disseminating this particular interpretation of Islam. And the problem here is that because they've been so successful, if you're a young kid growing up in Karachi, Pakistan, or in Cairo, Egypt, or in Toronto, Canada, and you're interested in finding out about your own religious heritage and connecting with it, the likelihood of you being exposed to a Wahhabi-informed interpretation of Islam is very high. And you think that that interpretation is normative, is authentic, because you don't hear any other interpretations being articulated. Most of the imams, the mosques, the literature are informed by this interpretation of Islam. The more ethical, the more humanistic interpretation of Islam that I would argue has dominated the Muslim world for much of its history is not one that you can find easy access to. And so this, right from the start, predisposes. The level field is not even here. it's tilted in the favor of this type of radicalization. The San Bernadino massacre and those two individuals also had Saudi links. We could talk about that if you want. But fundamentally, just to get toward a conclusion here, we cannot have an honest conversation about the toxic and negative role that Saudi Arabia has been playing in the Middle East, in Muslim communities around the world, unless we are honest and acknowledge that Saudi Arabia has become a major regional power and a very, important player in the politics of the Middle East as a direct result of a long-standing alliance that they've had with the West, particularly with the United States of America, going back to 1945, when then President Roosevelt met then King Ibn Saud on an American aircraft carrier, and they struck a very close alliance, where the two countries have been supporting each other for different reasons. From the perspective of the United States, largely for economic reasons. And it's not simply oil, it's really the amount of money that Saudi Arabia invests in our economy, purchasing many of our arms, investing in different aspects of our economic, of our banks. The reserve, Saudi Arabia is known to have about just under $1 trillion in reserves. Much of that is invested in this country. And so Saudi Arabia is a close ally, and no one wants to talk about it. And the evidence of how close the alliance has been was revealed to me approximately a year ago when the long-standing king of Saudi Arabia, King Abdullah, dies on January the 15th. It just so happened at the time that President Obama was on a state visit in India. And he stops his state visit short, cancels it, and leads his delegation, shifts the direction, and goes to Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, to pay homage to the new king. And at the time, just before he was leaving India to go to Saudi Arabia, Fareed Zakaria of CNN, who was on the trip, interviews President Obama and asks him, now that you're going to Saudi Arabia, and this was in the immediate aftermath of the Charlie Hebdo massacre in Paris, when everyone was outraged over what radical Islam was doing in Western cities. And he specifically asks President Obama, when you go to Saudi Arabia, are you going to discuss this problem of the puritanical interpretation of Islam that is coming out of Saudi Arabia and that is radicalizing these communities? Are you going to raise the question of human rights? At the time, there was another story that was circulating when this young 20-year-old blogger in Saudi Arabia, a guy by the name of Raif Badawi, was picked up and was condemned and was sentenced to 10 years in jail and 1,000 lashes for posting statements on his Facebook page calling for a more liberal interpretation of Islam. And Fareed Zakaria specifically asks President Obama, are you going to raise the case of Raif Badawi when you meet the new Saudi king? And President Obama looks at Fareed Zakaria and says, without batting an eyelash, no, I will not. Because every time we raise the question of human rights with Saudi Arabia, our Saudi friends get upset. And that's not the way we should treat our allies. He did, in his own defense, suggest that the United States has in times past tried to raise these issues in a roundabout way. But the point here is that when I was watching the death of the old Saudi king, the delegation that President Obama led to Saudi Arabia, and it wasn't just a Democratic delegation. This was Democrats, Republicans, senators on both sides of the aisle, business leaders, intellectuals. Everyone who was commenting on this event, the death of the king, Obama's delegation, everyone, every talking head on every news station was basically praising Saudi Arabia as our loyal ally. John Kerry, Secretary of State, referred to Saudi Arabia at the time as an island of stability in a troubled region. The only problem with that statement is Saudi Arabia is breeding instability everywhere it touches. And of course, we know this about Saudi Arabia. We know there's something deeply wrong. And we were reminded of this on 9/11, when it was announced that 15 out of the 19 hijackers came from one country, Saudi Arabia. That's not an accident. That suggests there's something deeply toxic and problematic within Saudi Arabia, where 15 middle-class, fairly educated young people think that the best way they can spend their lives on this planet is to engage in that type of suicidal terrorism. And so, in terms of a conclusion, well, that's the enduring Saudi alliance that I just talked about. In terms of a conclusion, the crisis that the Arab Islamic world is now facing was actually predicted and was to be expected. 14 years ago, approximately, in a series of UN Arab Human Development reports written by a team of leading Arab social scientists, they forecast and they predicted the deep crisis that was facing the region, hinting at a coming explosion. Starting in 2002, the first UN Arab Human Development Report concluded that the Arab world is at a crossroads and that the region is hampered by three key deficits: a freedom deficit, a women's empowerment deficit, and a knowledge deficit. Compared with the rest of the world, the Arab countries had the lowest freedom scores in the 1990s when measured by indicators such as political processes, civil liberties, political rights, a free media, etc. Similarly, this 2002 report also talked about the status of women, their opportunities. They applied the UN gender empowerment measure to the Arab world and found that the Arab world had the lowest scores for gender empowerment. Only sub-Saharan Africa had worse indicators. The 2004 report by the same organization, the UNDP, dealt with the theme of freedom and good governance and political reform, and it focused on the themes of good governance related to civil and political rights, popular participation and representation, political accountability of leadership, the existence of the rule of law, equality of treatment of citizens under the rule of law, the existence of an independent judiciary. All of these things were found to be in short supply. And so in conclusion, let me just quote to you from the words of one of the most, I think, astute observers of the Arab world today, the journalist and public intellectual Rami Khouri, who our university was proud to host in October. Writing about the ISIS crisis and the deep politics and the crisis facing the Arab world, he had the following words to say, quote, In my 45 years in the Arab world, observing and writing about the conditions on the ground, the only thing that surprises me now is why such an extremist phenomenon that has caused the catastrophic collapse of existing states didn't happen earlier. At least since around the year 1970, the average Arab citizen has lived in political, economic, and social systems that have offered zero accountability, political rights, or participation. States have been characterized by steadily expanding dysfunction and corruption. Economic disparities have expanded and have driven majorities of people into chronic poverty and humiliating inaction. And Rami Khouri blames this problem broadly on the existing authoritarian political order in the Arab world that has virtually banned the developing of one's full potential in terms of intellect, creativity, public participation, culture, and identity. The Islamic State phenomenon, Rami Khouri notes, is the last and perhaps not the final stop on a journey of mass Arab humiliation and dehumanization that has been primarily managed by the Arab autocratic regimes that revolve around single families or clans with immense and continuing support from foreign patrons. Foreign military attacks in Arab countries, such as in Iraq, have exacerbated this trend, as has Israeli aggression against the Palestinian people. But the single biggest driver of the kind of criminal Islamist extremism that we see today in the phenomenon of the Islamic State is the predicament of several hundreds of millions of individual Arab men and women who find that generation after generation, that in their own societies they are unable to achieve their full humanity or potential, or exercise their full powers of thought and creativity, and in many cases simply obtain the basic necessities of life. There is only one antidote, Rami Khouri has noted. There is only one antidote in the long run to eliminating the Islamic State and all that it represents, and that is to stop pursuing the abusive and criminal policies that have demeaned millions of decent Arab men and women and shaped Arab countries for the past half-century. Bombing Iraq and Syria will gain some time and probably must happen in combination with serious military action by local Arab and Kurdish forces. However, if the ways of the corrupt modern Arab security state is not radically reversed, the mass desperation and hysteria that the Islamic State represents will only reemerge again in more extreme forms in the years to come. Thank you for your attention.